Hey there, in this video, we are going to look at how we can memorize conversions between fractions and decimals one way or the other, and how we can use some of those more common conversions that you may have memorized to actually break down fractions or break down decimals to convert them from one to the other if you don't have all of them memorized. So, converting from decimal to fraction can be done with a calculator or without memorizing, but it can also be a very tedious process. So, to save time, it is really helpful to memorize those more common decimal and fraction conversions just to save you some time for testing. And memorizing them can actually help you in other more complex problems as well if you understand the conversions or memorize those conversions without having to do the actual conversions yourself. So let's take a look at some conversions between decimals and fractions. So we see here we have, for example, 0.0001. The equivalent fraction to that would be 1/10,000th. And equivalent fractions would be, for example, if I change the denominator to 100,000 by multiplying the top and the bottom by 10, that would be an equivalent fraction that could be helpful depending on the problem. 0.001 is 1/1000th. 0.002 is 1/500th. 0.0025 is 1/400th. So on and so on. So some of those, especially more common, helpful ones might be, for example, 0.05, maybe 1/20th, 0.02, 1/50th. So you can use these equivalent fractions over here. For example, you can use methods that allow us to take this 0.05 and make this 5/100ths, which would be over here, 5/100ths. That's not simplified all the way, so then you could simplify that to 1/20th. But again, if you know right away that 0.05 is 1/20th, then you take out that piece of having to simplify by changing it into 5/100ths and then dividing to get it to simplify to 1/20th. So having those memorized can be helpful. We have some other ones that are repeating decimals as well, like we see here. 0.111 is really 1/9, and that goes on. One is repeating. 0.125 is not a repeating one, that's just 1/8. 0.143. This one is not repeating, but it does go on and on and on. It's actually 0.1428557, so on and so on. So it's approximately 0.143. 1/6 is a repeating one, 0.1666, so on and so on. 1/5 is just 0.2. 1/4, a little more common, 0.25, so on and so on. 1/3 is 0.3 repeating. 2/3 then is 0.6 repeating. If you think about 1/3 multiplied by 2 is 2/3. 0.3 repeating. If you multiply all the threes by 2, you get 0.6 repeating. So again, this can be helpful to have memorized in terms of fractions and decimals and conversions. So if we have problems where maybe you don't have the fraction that's being used memorized in terms of the decimal, but you need it as a decimal, we can use the ones we do have memorized in a way to help us break down those fractions into easier units to convert into a decimal. So for example, if I don't have 4/9 memorized, but I do have 1/9 memorized, and 1/9 is 0.1 repeating, then I could essentially take this 4/9 and look at it as 4 times 1/9. And if I look at that as 4 times 1/9, and I know 1/9 is 0.111 repeating, if I multiply that by 4, each of these ones times 4 is just going to be 0.444 repeating. So 4/9 is really 0.4 repeating as a decimal. And then, for example, with number 2 here, 19/8, we've talked about changing an improper fraction into a mixed number, and we can use that start of that same process to help us. And when we do that, 19/8, you may not have that memorized, but you can look at, okay, how many eighths can I pull out of this 19? So start with 19, work backwards. 19 isn't divisible by 8, 18 isn't divisible by 8, 17 isn't divisible by 8, but 16 is divisible by 8. So we can do 16 over 8 plus the remaining part over 8. And the remaining part is what number gets added to 16 to get us back to that original 19, and that would be 3. So if we break that down into 16/8 plus 3/8, 16/8 is going to really be 16 divided by 8, which is 2, plus 3/8. Now, 3/8 you may have memorized as opposed to the 19 over 8 that you did not have memorized. Again, you may not. So if you don't have the 3/8, we could even break that down further. And 3/8, we could think of that as 3 times 1/8. And then we still have 2 plus all that. So if I know that 1/8 is equivalent to 0.125, then when I do 3 times 0.125, I end up with 0.375. And you can think of that like each individual digit, or you can think of it, for example, 125 times 3. Well, 100 times 3 is 300. So we know it's going to start with a 3 here. Then 25 times 3 is going to give us 75. So 375. So 0.375 is actually this 3 times 1/8 here, 3 times 0.125. So that gives us 2 plus 0.375, which comes out to be 2.375. So that is another way to look at how we can use the fraction to decimal conversions that we do have memorized to help us simplify the ones that maybe we don't. Now we can do a similar thing with decimals to fractions. So if we're converting from a decimal to a fraction, for example, 0.8, we can change that decimal into a fraction using some conversions that we have memorized. So if you don't have 0.8 memorized, maybe you have 0.2 memorized. So 0.2 is really 1/5. So if I can rethink this 0.8 as 0.2 times 4, because 2 times 4 is 8. And if I have that decimal there, that's going to be 0.8 when I multiply these together. So that's equivalent to 0.8. But then I'm able to break this down. This 0.2 I know is 1/5. And if I multiply that by 4, then I get 4/5. So again, you may not write all this out, but I'm just kind of showing you the steps that you might do in your head, or maybe you do jot down. But 0.8 is 4/5. And that is one way to do it. In addition to, there are other ways. So you could do 8 over 10, for example, and simplify that to 4/5. So you have many options. You could just memorize the 0.8. It's really dependent on what you're comfortable with. But the more you have memorized, the more time you will save on your actual test. Now with the 45, again, maybe you have, like we talked about when we looked at the table, 0.05 memorized, and that's 1/20th. So if you know 0.05 is 1/20th, think about 45 as a whole number. If we had 45, 5 times 9 is 45. So if we have 0.45, if I make that 0.05 times 9, that's going to be 0.45. And I can do that. And it's equivalent to 0.45, but then I'm able to turn this 0.05 into 1/20th. And that times 9 is just going to be 9/20ths, which would be 0.45 written as a fraction. So we can really break that down to help us simplify or convert from one form to another. So again, as a recap, memorizing is helpful, but there are ways to break down fractions and decimals to get around memorization, as long as you have some of the most basic ones memorized. But it is helpful to be familiar with those equivalent fractions to avoid spending extra time on simplification, but rather just having them memorized can really save you that time.